I know I'm just an old guy spinning tales, but some tales aren't meant to be ignored. Trust me, you'll want to hear this one. So turn down the lights, settle in, and let's dive into today's chilling stories. Before we begin, a fair warning. What you're about to hear is purely for entertainment. These stories and theories, they're nothing more than shadows in the dark. No proof, just whispers carried by the night. Listen closely, but don't say, "I didn't warn you." Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The first night of any new job is always awkward, but this felt off from the start. It was an old office building, the kind you'd drive past without a second thought. Dimly lit parking lot, cracked concrete, and a faint hum of flickering fluorescent lights. My supervisor, a man named Carl, handed me a ring of keys that jingled ominously as I gripped them. "Pretty simple," Carl said, his voice gruff and tired, like he'd been doing this job far too long. "Clean the floors, take out the trash, lock up when you're done. Oh, and..." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, thrusting it into my hand. "Follow these, to the letter." I opened the paper, expecting some kind of checklist. Instead, it was a handwritten list of rules. Strange rules. Rules for the night shift. Never use the elevator after 12 a.m. It doesn't stop where you want it to. If you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. Just keep walking. The office on the 5th floor is always locked. If you find it open, close it immediately and leave the building. Do not clean the mirrors in the bathrooms. Do not look at them longer than necessary. If you hear a phone ringing on the 7th floor, do not answer it. At exactly 3:33 a.m., take a 5-minute break in the break room. No exceptions. I stared at the list, then back at Carl. Is this a joke? He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. You think I'd waste time writing this crap for fun? His eyes were dead serious. You want to keep this job? Follow the rules. Don't ask questions. Don't mess up. Before I could say anything else, Carl was gone, leaving me alone in the dimly lit lobby. The only sounds were the faint hum of the lights and the distant groan of the air conditioning. The first couple of hours were uneventful. The building was massive but eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I cleaned the main lobby, emptied trash cans, and mopped the hallways, all while clutching the list like a lifeline. By midnight, I'd almost convinced myself the rules were just some weird office tradition. A hazing ritual, maybe. But as the clock struck 12:01, something changed. The air felt heavier, like the walls themselves were pressing in. The fluorescent lights flickered, their hum growing louder. I glanced at the elevator at the end of the hallway. The doors stood open, the interior lit by a pale, flickering light. I froze, my grip tightening on the mop handle. The list's first rule echoed in my mind. Never use the elevator after 12 a.m. I turned away, my heart racing, and forced myself to focus on the next task. But as I walked past the mirrored walls of the lobby, I thought I saw movement behind me. A shadow, just out of sync with my own reflection. I stopped, staring at the mirror. My reflection stared back, perfectly still. Too still. My chest rose and fell with each shaky breath, but the figure in the mirror didn't move. The list's fourth rule screamed in my head. Do not look at the mirrors longer than necessary. I stumbled backward, dropping my mop, and when I looked up again, the reflection was normal. Shaking, I made my way to the 5th floor. The hallway was lined with offices, each door closed and locked, except for one. The door to Office 502 was ajar, light spilling out into the hallway. I stopped dead in my tracks, gripping the list tightly in my hand. The office on the 5th floor is always locked. If you find it open, close it immediately and leave the building. My throat felt dry as I approached the door. The closer I got, the colder the air became. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed the door shut. The soft click of the latch echoed in the empty hallway. I didn't wait to find out what was inside. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my footsteps echoing loudly. As I descended, I heard it. Faint, deliberate footsteps following me. I froze mid-step, gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. The list's second rule rang in my ears. If you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. Just keep walking. The steps grew louder, closer. My instincts screamed at me to turn, to look, but I forced myself to move forward, one shaky step at a time. The sound followed me all the way to the lobby. As I reached the bottom step, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. By the time 3:30 a.m. rolled around, I was barely holding it together. I glanced at the clock on the wall, my eyes darting nervously around the room. 3 minutes. I made my way to the break room, collapsing into a chair. The list said to take a 5-minute break at exactly 3:33 a.m. No exceptions. I stared at the clock as the seconds ticked by, holding my breath as it struck 3:33. The lights in the break room flickered. For 5 long minutes, the building seemed to hold its breath. The air was electric, thick, with an unnatural stillness. At 3:38, the tension broke. The lights steadied, the air lightened, and I felt like I could breathe again. When my shift finally ended, the sun was rising, casting faint light through the dusty windows. I left the building without looking back, clutching the list in my hand like a talisman. Carl was waiting for me outside, leaning against his car. He eyed me up and down, smirking faintly. "Survived the first night, huh?" "What is this place?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Carl didn't answer. He just laughed and got into his car. As I watched him drive away, I realized something chilling. The list wasn't a joke. It was a warning. And whatever I had stepped into was only just beginning. I didn't want to go back. After the terror of my first night, I spent the next day debating if I should just quit. But rent was due, and jobs weren't exactly growing on trees. Besides, I thought, maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe the shadows, the footsteps, and the flickering lights were all just my mind playing tricks on me. I convinced myself to go back, but not without a plan. I tucked a small flashlight into my pocket, alongside a lucky charm my grandmother had given me years ago. I wasn't superstitious, but last night had changed something in me. The building felt heavier when I arrived, the air thick and oppressive, like it knew I'd come back. Carl was nowhere to be found, and I didn't know whether to be relieved or worried. I unfolded the list, my eyes scanning the handwritten rules again. They looked almost alive in the dim lobby light, the ink slightly smudged as if it had been freshly written. Don't use the elevator after 12 a.m. Don't clean the mirrors or look at them too long. At exactly 3:33 a.m., take a break. Each line carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. Midway through the shift, around 1 a.m., I was cleaning the 4th floor hallway. My nerves were already frayed, but I told myself to push through. I'd even started humming to myself to break the silence, the sound bouncing off the empty walls. Then I heard it, a phone ringing. At first, I thought I imagined it. But the sound persisted, faint but clear, echoing through the empty building. My heart sank as I realized where it was coming from. The 7th floor. I froze, my eyes darting to the list. If you hear a phone ringing on the 7th floor, do not answer it. The logical part of me screamed to leave it alone. But another part, the part that was tired, skeptical, and maybe a little too curious, pushed me toward the stairwell. "It's just a phone," I muttered under my breath. "Nothing will happen if I just look." I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the metal steps echoing ominously. The ringing grew louder, sharper, and by the time I reached the 7th floor, it felt like the sound was inside my skull. The hallway was dark, the fluorescent lights flickering sporadically. At the far end, an old rotary phone sat on a small table, its receiver vibrating with each ring. "Just don't pick it up," I whispered to myself, stepping closer. The phone stopped ringing. For a moment, I felt relief, until the phone rang again, louder this time. The sound made me jump, and before I could stop myself, I grabbed the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. At first, there was nothing, just static, faint and distant. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft and chilling, like wind passing through an empty graveyard. "You broke the rule," the voice said. I slammed the receiver down, my hands trembling. The hallway grew colder, the flickering lights now strobing violently. A deep, resonating hum filled the air, like the building itself was alive and angry. Then I saw it. A shadow at the far end of the hallway, darker than the surrounding darkness. It wasn't moving, but I felt its presence, heavy and suffocating. My legs locked, my instincts screaming to run, but I couldn't. The shadow began to shift, stretching unnaturally across the floor, like ink spreading in water. My breath hitched as it crept closer, swallowing the weak light around it. "Run," a voice whispered, faint but urgent. It wasn't coming from the phone. It was inside my head. I bolted, sprinting down the stairs as fast as my legs could carry me. The air around me felt alive, pressing against me like invisible hands trying to pull me back. I reached the lobby and yanked on the door to the outside, but it wouldn't budge. The key ring in my pocket jingled as I fumbled for the right one, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Behind me, I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I shoved the key into the lock, twisting it frantically. The door finally gave way, and I stumbled outside, collapsing onto the cold concrete. The footsteps stopped just inside the lobby. When I looked back, the shadow was there, standing still, watching me through the glass doors. Carl was waiting for me again in the parking lot, leaning against his car with a cigarette in hand. He didn't look surprised to see me, even though I was pale, shaking, and gasping for air. "You answered the phone, didn't you?" he asked, exhaling a puff of smoke. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, the list clutched tightly in my hand. Carl sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Rule number 1, kid. Don't get curious. Curiosity gets you killed around here." What was that thing?" I finally managed to ask, my voice hoarse. Carl's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "Just stick to the rules from now on. You'll be fine. Probably." "Probably?" I snapped, anger and fear bubbling up inside me. "You knew this would happen." Carl flicked his cigarette onto the pavement, crushing it under his boot. "You signed up for the job, didn't you?" When I got home that morning, I unfolded the list again. My hands were steadier now, but the words seemed heavier, darker. A new rule had been added at the bottom of the page. If you break a rule, they will follow you. The ink was fresh. I didn't sleep that day. Every shadow in my apartment felt alive. Every sound amplified. And when I checked my phone, I saw a missed call from an unknown number. The call came at exactly 6 p.m. I was sitting on my couch, trying to ignore the shadows creeping along the edges of my apartment. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and the screen lit up with those haunting words, "Unknown caller." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to answer it. I knew better now. But the phone kept vibrating, persistent and loud, filling the room with an unbearable tension. Against my better judgment, I picked it up and stared at the screen. I let it ring. After what felt like an eternity, the call ended, leaving my apartment eerily silent. But then my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call, it was a message. "You can't ignore us forever." By the time my next shift rolled around, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The rules weren't just guidelines anymore. They were a lifeline. I read them over and over, memorizing each one, hoping I wouldn't slip up again. When I arrived at the building, Carl wasn't there to greet me. The parking lot was empty, and the building felt colder than ever. I hesitated at the entrance, gripping the keys tightly in my hand. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was heavier, the silence thicker, like the building was watching me. I pulled out the list, my eyes scanning the rules again. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something new. Another rule had appeared, written in the same smudged ink. Do not enter the basement under any circumstances. I avoided the elevator completely that night, sticking to the stairs even though my legs burned with each climb. Every time I passed the elevator, its doors would open, unprompted, the interior bathed in that pale, flickering light. It felt like an invitation, one I had no intention of accepting. But as I reached the third floor, the elevator dinged again. This time, I heard something, a faint, melodic humming. It wasn't the usual mechanical hum of the elevator. It was a voice. I froze, my heart racing. The humming grew louder, more distinct, like it was coming from inside the elevator. I gripped the list tightly, the words of the first rule burning in my mind. Never use the elevator after 12 a.m. It doesn't stop where you want it to. I backed away, refusing to look inside. The door slid shut, but the humming didn't stop. It echoed through the hallways, following me as I continued my rounds. Later that night, I found myself in the second-floor restroom. The rules said not to clean the mirrors, but they were smudged with greasy fingerprints, and I couldn't stand the sight of them. "It'll be fine," I muttered to myself, grabbing a rag and glass cleaner. "Just one mirror, nothing will happen." As I wiped the surface, I kept my gaze down, avoiding my reflection. But as I worked, I felt a strange pressure, like something was pressing against the back of my neck. I glanced up and froze. In the mirror, my reflection stared back, but it wasn't me. Its eyes were wrong, too wide, too dark, and its mouth twisted into a grin I wasn't wearing. "Stop cleaning," it whispered, its voice low and distorted. I stumbled backward, dropping the rag. The reflection tilted its head, watching me with an unnerving stillness. My chest tightened as I fumbled for the door handle, yanking it open and sprinting out into the hallway. By 2:30 a.m., I was ready to quit. My nerves were shot, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. I sat in the break room, clutching the list like it was the only thing keeping me alive. And that's when I heard it. A faint knocking sound, echoing through the building. It wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It was coming from below. My heart sank. The basement. I'd never seen the basement before, and I had no intention of finding it. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent, like it was calling to me. Against every instinct, I stood and followed the sound. At the end of the first-floor hallway, I found the basement door. It was old and rusted, with a padlock hanging loosely from the handle. A faint flickering light spilled out from the cracks around the edges. The list's newest rule flashed in my mind. Do not enter the basement under any circumstances. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more desperate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was down there. I reached for the handle, hesitating as a voice whispered in my mind, "Don't do it." But curiosity, or maybe something darker, drove me forward. As soon as I turned the handle, the knocking stopped. The air grew cold, and a deep, resonating hum filled the hallway. I pulled back, fear gripping me, but before I could move, the padlock snapped open and fell to the floor with a loud clang. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stepped back, slamming the door shut and locking it with the padlock. My hands shook as I backed away, the hum still reverberating in my ears. When I returned to the break room, another rule had been added to the list. The basement door must always remain locked. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, but something felt different. As I left the building, the shadows in the parking lot seemed to stretch toward me, watching. Carl was waiting in his car, his window rolled down. "Looks like you survived another night," he said, his tone almost mocking. "Carl," I said, gripping the list, "what's in the basement?" His smile faded. "You don't want to know." Before I could press him further, he drove off, leaving me alone in the cold, empty lot. As I got into my car, my phone buzzed with another message. "You're closer than you think." The morning after my third shift, I decided I needed answers. Enough was enough. The rules weren't just bizarre, they were alive. They were growing, adapting, reacting to my every move. And the building, it wasn't just a building. Carl wasn't going to tell me the truth, but I had another idea. If this place had rules, then someone had to have written them. Someone who knew what was really going on. It took me hours of digging through old records and online forums, but I finally found something. A mention of the building in a forgotten thread on a conspiracy website. "Nightshift rules are meant to protect you," one post said, "but if you break them, the building will remind you who's really in charge." Another post linked to a scanned journal, supposedly written by a janitor who had worked the same job decades ago. My heart pounded as I clicked the link. The pages were old, faded, but the handwriting was eerily similar to the list in my pocket. They don't tell you about the basement on your first day. They want you to think it's just an ordinary job. But it's not. The building is alive. It feeds off us, the rules, the fear, the sacrifices. If you follow the rules, it'll let you live. If you break them, you become part of it. The mirrors show its true form. That's why you can't look for too long. And the phone? It's how it talks to you. It pretends to warn you, but it's just testing you, seeing how far you'll go. My hands trembled as I read the final entry. I heard knocking from the basement last night. I locked the door, just like the rules say. But I know it's only a matter of time. Once the knocking starts, it doesn't stop. Not until it gets what it wants. The journal wasn't enough. I needed more. I went to the city archives, pretending I was working on a project for school. The clerk seemed suspicious, but handed over a stack of old documents. Anyway, the building had been constructed in the 1940s, originally as a government facility. But what caught my attention was a single incident report from 1963. 3 employees went missing on the night of October 13th. No signs of forced entry or struggle. The basement was searched, but nothing was found. Case remains unsolved. I flipped through more pages, my heart racing. A pattern emerged: missing employees, strange noises, unexplained power surges. The basement wasn't just part of the building. It was the heart of whatever was happening. When I arrived for my next shift, the air in the building felt heavier than ever. I clutched the list tightly, every word etched into my mind. Carl was there this time, leaning against the reception desk. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen before: fear. "You don't look so good," I said, trying to lighten the tension. He didn't laugh. "You've been digging, haven't you?" I froze. "What do you mean?" Carl sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're not the first to go looking for answers. But let me tell you something. Once you know too much, the building knows too." "What's in the basement, Carl?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just handed me a flashlight. "You'll find out soon enough." Halfway through my shift, I found myself in the 3rd-floor hallway, cleaning up a spill near one of the restrooms. The mirrors in the hallway caught my eye, reflecting the faint glow of the overhead lights. I remembered the journal's warning: the mirrors show its true form. I hesitated, then took a cautious step closer. My reflection seemed normal at first, but as I stared, it began to shift. The background of the hallway in the mirror wasn't the same as the one behind me. In the reflection, the walls were cracked, bleeding a dark, tar-like substance. Shadows moved along the ceiling, writhing and twisting like living things. And then I saw it. A face, pale and hollow-eyed, appeared behind my reflection. It wasn't human. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, jagged teeth glinting as it whispered, "You don't belong here." I stumbled backward, my head spinning. When I looked at the real hallway, everything was normal. But the mirror? The face was still there, watching me. By 3 a.m., I was ready to quit for good. I sat in the break room, staring at the list, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when the phone rang again. The sound echoed through the building, louder and sharper than before. I ignored it, focusing on the rules. If you hear a phone ringing on the 7th floor, do not answer it. But this time, the ringing didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the entire building was vibrating with the sound. The lights flickered, and a voice whispered in my mind, "Answer it, or they will." My hands shook as I stood, making my way to the stairwell. The rules said not to answer, but the building wasn't giving me a choice. I reached the 7th floor, the phone's shrill ringing filling the air. The rotary phone sat on the table, its receiver vibrating. I stared at it, my chest tight, every instinct screaming to run. The ringing stopped. A new sound echoed through the building, a deep, resonating knock coming from below. My blood ran cold. The basement. I bolted down the stairs, the knocking growing louder with each step. When I reached the basement door, it was wide open. A faint, flickering light spilled out, illuminating the staircase descending into darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, a figure stood waiting, its pale, hollow eyes fixed on me. The figure at the bottom of the stairs didn't move. Its pale, hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt frozen in place. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, the kind that seeps into your bones and doesn't let go. Then it smiled. Not a human smile, but something stretched too wide, jagged teeth glinting in the flickering light. My heart raced as the knocking sound grew louder, reverberating through the building like a pulse. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct told me to turn around, lock the door, and never look back. But something deeper, a pull I couldn't resist, forced me forward. The basement steps were cold and damp, the air heavy with the smell of mildew, and something metallic. Blood, maybe. The figure didn't move as I approached, but its presence filled the narrow staircase, suffocating and oppressive. When I reached the bottom, the figure vanished, leaving me alone in a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with old pipes, their surfaces corroded and dripping with condensation. At the far end of the hallway was a door. Unlike the others in the building, this one was pristine. No rust, no cracks, just a smooth, black surface. Carved into it were the words, "The Final Rule." I approached the door slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. My mind raced, piecing together everything I'd read in the journal and the rules I'd been given. Whatever was behind that door, it was the heart of everything, the source of the building's darkness. A small plaque was mounted beside the door, covered in dust. I wiped it clean and read the engraved words, "To leave, one must replace." The rules are not to protect you, they are to protect it. I stumbled back, my chest tightening. It was a trap. The list, the rules, the warnings, they weren't there to keep me safe. They were there to keep whatever was in this basement contained. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Then, the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A voice whispered from the shadows, low and distorted. "Step inside, and the job is yours." I backed away, my pulse hammering. What do you mean?" I stammered. The voice chuckled, deep and guttural. "You've already broken the rules. You've seen too much. Now you must decide, join us or leave them to take your place." "Them?" I asked, my voice trembling. As if on cue, the walls around me began to shift. Shadows poured out from the cracks, twisting and writhing like living things. Faces emerged from the darkness, hollow, anguished faces that screamed silently as they clawed at the air. They were the others, the ones who had broken the rules before me. "You can end their suffering," the voice said. "Take the list. Become the keeper of the rules." I stepped closer to the door, my mind racing. If I didn't do this, someone else would come after me. Someone else would find the list, and the cycle would continue. But if I stayed, if I accepted the bargain, I'd be trapped here forever. Another pawn in the building's twisted game. The voice spoke again, softer now. "You were chosen for a reason. The list was meant for you." I looked down at the paper in my hand. The ink seemed to pulse, alive, as if the rules themselves were waiting for my answer. I took a deep breath and stepped through the door. The darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment I felt nothing. No fear, no pain, just a cold emptiness. Then the light returned, and I found myself back in the lobby. But something was different. The list in my hand had changed. My name was now scrawled at the top, and a new rule had been added at the bottom. The rules are absolute. Enforce them at all costs. Carl was standing by the reception desk, his expression grim. "Welcome to the team," he said, tossing me a flashlight. The rest of the night was uneventful, almost normal. The building was quiet, the shadows still, but I could feel them watching me. The list was no longer a guide, it was a command. As dawn approached, I stood by the front door, waiting for my replacement to arrive. A young woman stepped inside, clutching a bag nervously. "Hi," she said, smiling awkwardly. "I'm here for the night shift job." I handed her the list, my voice steady. "Follow these, to the letter." Her eyes scanned the rules, a confused smile crossing her face. "Is this a joke?" I didn't respond. I just turned and walked away, the weight of the building's secrets pressing down on me. The rules weren't mine to question anymore. They were mine to enforce. The weight of the list pressed heavily in my pocket as I left the building that morning. The sun rose on the horizon, but it didn't bring the warmth or relief I'd hoped for. The job wasn't over. It would never be over. The rules weren't just instructions. They were chains, and I was bound to them now. The young woman's nervous smile stuck in my mind as I sat in my car, staring at the building. She didn't know what she was walking into. Neither had I. But the difference was, I had a choice now, a chance to stop this. I couldn't just pass the curse on, not like Carl had done to me. If I walked away, if I let her take the job, I'd be complicit. But the list whispered to me, the words almost alive in my mind. The rules are absolute. Enforce them at all costs. As I drove home, the shadows in my apartment seemed darker than usual. My reflection in the bathroom mirror lingered too long, its eyes following me even when I looked away. The faint hum of a phone ringing echoed in my ears, though there was no phone in sight. The building wasn't happy. It knew what I was thinking. I pulled the list from my pocket and stared at it. My name was at the top, the ink pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. A new rule appeared, written in the same smudged handwriting. You cannot escape. The rules will find you. That night, I returned to the building earlier than usual. The new janitor hadn't arrived yet, and the air inside was heavy with tension. The fluorescent lights buzzed angrily, flickering more than usual, as if the building itself was watching me. I walked the halls, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. The mirrors seemed to shimmer, and the knocking from the basement was louder now, almost constant. I reached the break room and pulled out the journal I'd found during my research. Flipping to the final pages, I found what I was looking for. A hint, buried in the ramblings of the previous janitor. The rules are the key. Break them all, and the building will respond. But beware, the price may be worse than the job. If the rules were meant to keep the building contained, then breaking them all at once might disrupt its hold. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance I had to end this. I started with the easiest one. At 12:01 a.m., I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed behind me, and the fluorescent light inside flickered wildly. The elevator groaned as it descended, not to the lobby, but to a floor that didn't exist. The walls warped and twisted, the air growing colder with each passing second. When the doors opened, I wasn't in the building anymore. A dark, endless void stretched before me, filled with faint whispers and shifting shadows. "You've made a mistake," a voice said, low and guttural. I hit the button for the lobby, and the doors slammed shut, the elevator lurching violently as it returned to the main floor. Next, I went to the third floor and stood in front of the hallway mirrors. I didn't just look into them, I stared. My reflection twisted and shifted, its features melting into something grotesque. The shadows in the mirror began to writhe, their forms reaching toward me. I forced myself to stay, even as my reflection whispered, "You don't belong here." The mirror cracked, spiderwebbing out from the center. I turned and ran, the sound of shattering glass echoing behind me. The knocking from the basement grew deafening as I approached the door. This time it wasn't locked. It swung open easily, revealing the staircase descending into darkness. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my hand trembling as I made my way down. The air was colder than before, the metallic smell almost overwhelming. At the bottom of the stairs, the black door stood open, its surface rippling like liquid. The shadows inside moved with purpose, forming a figure that stepped forward. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the basement. "I'm ending this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The figure laughed, a deep, hollow sound that made my chest tighten. "You are part of this now. You always were." I pulled the list from my pocket and held it up. "This is your hold on me, right? The rules, the fear. If I break them all, you lose control." The figure paused, its hollow eyes narrowing. "If you break the rules, the building will devour you. Are you willing to pay the price?" "Yes," I said, my voice firm. The shadows surged toward me, wrapping around my body like icy tendrils. The list in my hand burned, the words dissolving into ash as the building screamed around me. The walls shook, the lights flickered, and the shadows pulled me into the black door. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the lobby. The building was quiet, eerily still. The list was gone, the weight of its rules lifted from my mind. I stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. For the first time, the building didn't feel alive. It was just a structure, empty and lifeless. But as I walked to my car, I noticed something on the ground, a piece of paper fluttering in the breeze. I picked it up, my stomach sinking as I read the words scrawled across the top. "Rules for the night shift." A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. When I turned, no one was there. The piece of paper fluttered in my hand as I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Rules for the night shift. But this list was different. The handwriting wasn't the same smudged script I'd come to know. It was clean, crisp, and written in my handwriting. My heart raced as I scanned the rules. Each one was familiar, but at the bottom, a new line had been added. "Congratulations, you're free, but the job isn't over." I crumpled the paper, my mind spinning. I'd done it. I'd broken the rules, confronted the entity, and survived. The building should have been empty now, powerless. So why was the list still here? The next day, I returned to the building in broad daylight. The once imposing structure now looked like any other forgotten office building, its windows dull and lifeless. I stepped inside, expecting the suffocating atmosphere to greet me. Instead, the air was still, the silence comforting rather than oppressive. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, their flicker gone. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then I saw her, the young woman I'd met on my last shift, standing in the lobby with the list clutched in her hands. She looked up at me, confusion and fear etched across her face. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, holding up the list. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, my body moved on its own. I took the list from her hands and scanned it, the rules as clear as ever. My name was gone from the top, replaced by hers. "You'll be fine," I heard myself say, though the words felt foreign. "Just follow the rules, and nothing will happen." The young woman looked at me, her fear melting into unease. "But what if I mess up?" I smiled faintly, though my chest felt heavy. "Just don't. And if you need help, call me." I handed her the list, and as I walked out of the building, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The message was from an unknown number. "You can't leave completely. The rules are watching." My hands trembled as I opened my car door. When I sat down, a new list was waiting for me on the dashboard. It was shorter this time, but the first rule hit me like a punch to the gut. Keep the cycle going. Beneath it, another line. You are now the keeper of the rules. Weeks passed, and the young woman survived her shifts. I monitored from a distance, compelled to intervene only when the rules were in jeopardy. I didn't work the night shift anymore. I didn't need to. The building had a new occupant, and as long as she followed the rules, the cycle stayed intact. But sometimes, when the air was still and the shadows seemed too quiet, I felt it. The building's gaze, watching me from afar, waiting for the day someone broke the rules beyond repair. One evening, I received a call from the young woman. Her voice was frantic, panicked. "The basement door, it's open," she said. My stomach dropped. "Did you lock it?" It wasn't locked when I got here," she said, her voice trembling. "What do I do?" I gripped the phone tightly. "Leave. Right now. Get out, and don't look back." "But the list says—" "Forget the list," I shouted. "Just run." The call cut off. I drove to the building as fast as I could, my mind racing. The lights inside were flickering wildly, the shadows in the windows writhing like living things. When I stepped inside, the air was colder than ever. The young woman's flashlight lay on the floor, its beam pointed toward the basement door. The door was wide open, revealing only darkness inside. I took a step forward, my heart pounding, when I saw it, a new piece of paper lying on the floor. I picked it up, the words scrawled hastily across the page. "You can't stop it. The cycle isn't yours to break." The shadows moved towards me, their forms twisting and shifting, voices whispering all around. "Join us." The building wanted me back. It had never let me go. I took a deep breath, clutching the paper tightly. "No," I whispered. "You don't control me anymore." The shadows froze, their whispers growing louder. The walls trembled, the air thick with their rage. But I didn't run. I walked toward the basement door, my footsteps steady. If the cycle couldn't be broken, I'd face whatever was in the basement myself. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. The next morning, a new janitor arrived at the building, a nervous young man clutching a list of rules. Carl stood in the parking lot, watching him with a faint smirk. "You'll be fine," he said. The building's shadows loomed in the windows, waiting